Everybody. My name's Brendan. I'm a lawyer. I'm based in Sydney, and I do work in technology contracting, which basically means doing contracts which relate to technology. And I've got a special focus on free and open source software, and so that's why I'm here to talk to you today about negotiating contracts involving open source components. The main, the point of view that I'm trying to take here is where you're a developer who has some sort of, sorry, not necessarily a developer, but you're a supplier rather than a customer. So what's happening here? Do you have another laptop? I can move the PowerPoints over to you.
Maybe move it to our computer there. It's a Windows computer too. Yeah.
Do you have a, well, as long as it's got Open Office on it.
It has Word.
Well, if it's got, that's right. If you've got a, that's all right, I've exported it to a PDF, but I need a USB key. Oh, I do, it's so many of these. So, sorry, the point of view that I'm wanting to take is from the view of a supplier of the software rather than a customer. So, I'm doing that on the assumption that that's what you're more interested in. And the key theme that's going to go through the whole of this, the key theme that's going to go through the whole of the talk will be sorry. Okay, try that. That's a PDF. So the main theme that's going to be running through all of this is it all depends. That's going to be the answer to sort of every question. It's going to be, well, it all depends. And the difficult thing for me was in doing this talk was that it does all depend, and so it's very difficult. It was very difficult for me to pick out those things which were relevant enough to talk to you about, but not so specific as to lose you all. And the other thing is that, well, the other takeaway issue that I wanted to make to you, the other takeaway point, was that you, to the extent you can, you should be making it clear up front what you're doing, what it is you're doing and what it is you're not doing. And we go. Can't find it? Having multiple failures, isn't that fantastic? So the aim of the talk was to talk about practical things rather than theoretical things. And one of the where I want to try and get you to is some of the things you should think about in getting to a contract which involves free and open source software and one that you're happy with. And in order to get to such a contract, you have to start from wherever you have to start from here, give you a sort of an overview of what happens in contracting, what's involved in contracting, what's involved in the negotiation process. And then talk about specific FLOSS-related issues. And those issues are things like licensing, maintaining the code, and liability and indemnities that you might want to give or not give in relation to free and open source software. And so the first topic of all of those was contracts. And you might ask, well, why would you have a contract at all? And the thing is, you practically all of the time that you're involved in doing anything for anybody, you have a contract or you have an agreement. When you say to somebody, oh yes, I will do that for you, that actually is a contract. Assuming that some other, conditions are satisfied, you do still have a contract there. But most people, when they're talking about contracts, don't think about that as being a contract. What they think about with a contract is something that looks like this. It's a piece of paper that they can touch and look at and write on and scribble on and those sorts of things. The point of taking an agreement and reducing it to writing, there are typically two things that you're trying to achieve. And the first thing is clarity. So what you're trying to achieve is an understanding of what it is you're supposed to be doing in the course of performing the contract. So that's because it can often be the case where you've agreed to do something, but what you think you've agreed to do is different from what the other person thinks that you've agreed to do. And so the process of going through a contract actually identifies that difference in understanding. So that's the first. That's the first thing, and in many respects that's the most important part of doing a contract. The other aspect of doing a contract is apportioning risk. So the point of a contract is to say, well, you're doing this for me. You're going to get in trouble if you don't do it correctly. And part of apportioning risk is working out, well, what could go wrong, and then apportioning that risk one way or the other to one person or another person, one party or another party to the contract. The thing about apportioning risk is the risk actually has an impact on what it is you're doing. Right? So if you've got an obligation to do something, it sort of doesn't mean anything to have that obligation unless you know what the consequences of failing to do that obligation, or failing to perform that obligation are. So if I say, well, yes, I'm going to save the world tomorrow, but if I don't save the world, then I have no consequences, then that obligation is something of an empty obligation. In a sense, there's no point me promising to do it. And so the consequences of a breach are integral in defining what the obligations are. And the other thing about risk and obligation and clarity and those things is it all pivots around price, right? So there are lots of things that you might be prepared to do for X dollars, which you wouldn't be prepared to do if it was for X dollars minus some amount. And equally, you would be prepared to do more things if the amount of price increased. And so there's an issue that, well, I guess what goes on to what I was saying is it all depends, right? It all depends on the specific circumstances involved. And at the end of this, or towards the end of the talk, I'm going to be saying, well, don't agree to this, don't agree to that, don't agree to the other thing. And while I will say those things, I don't mean that in an absolute sense. I don't mean never ever in any circumstances ever agree to these things, but rather, ordinarily start from this position and don't do it. But, if there's some reason like, it's a strategic sale that you're involved in, or the price is particularly good, or you think the risk of the thing happening is not particularly high, then ignore my advice and just go ahead and sign up to it. So the issue that I wanted to, or the scenario that I wanted to give you was like a sample contract. So if you think about the case where a person engages a builder to build a shed, so let's say that's all. And they build the shed, the builder builds the shed, and the shed falls down. Let's say it kills someone's cat. And who's liable for that, for the death of that darling poor creature, the cat? I don't know whose cat it was, but let's say that. What sort of factors do you think, or does anyone have a view about who's liable? Can everyone hear me? Good.
That bit's working.
Do you have? Well, can you give me some views about who you think's liable? The person who engaged the builder, or a third party?
I think the builder had an implied warranty of fitness.
Okay, implied warranty from the builder. Any other? So you think probably it's going to be the builder who's going to get caught. Anybody else? Have you? Property owner, because they let the cat wander around. What other factors might you think might be relevant to determining who's liable for this shed falling down? Fault in the materials, yeah, okay, that's good. Other ideas? Not the original, I mean, that's probably, you're taking my next slide. Don't do that. What the original agreement was? Next door neighbour? Or it might have been, I don't know, I said it. As you can see on the slide, I said maybe it's Schrodinger's cat. Any other sort of? The council for approving a building. All right, so there's lots of factors which might be involved, and the answer is, well, you can't really tell, right? Ahead of time, on the facts that I've given you, which are very minimal, you can't actually tell who is liable. You can have some views about who ought to be liable, but all of those things that you mentioned are all relevant. Right? They're all relevant to determining the liability. And of course, key was the point. Is it Anne? Did I meet you earlier? Anne made was that it's what was agreed. Right? So if the builder and the property owner have agreed a certain thing, that in these circumstances the builder will be liable or won't be liable, then that's where you go, the contract. But as someone mentioned, maybe the materials were dodgy, right? And that becomes then the question becomes, well, who supplied the materials? Whose materials were they? And later on in the talk, that's going to be where did that software come from, for example. And so you might say, well, who supplied the materials? And are you actually making progress? Who supplied the materials? Who ought to have? Who supplied the materials? Right? Was it the builder? Right? Did the builder supply the material? Hey, there I am. That's me. And now I have to. All right, now I'm just going to reboot. I'm going to reset, and now I'm going to start at the start. Let's see. Full screen now. All right. Look, this is the most important thing. Pivots on price. That's what's important. Oh, sorry, you think it's better not full screen. Is that what you're saying? All right, I'll do that. But then I can't use arrows to move forward. Page down. Good idea. Blah, blah, blah. Dodgy builder. See, Schrodinger's cat? Who's liable? Well, we don't know, do we? But see, some of the other things I put up there was maybe there was an external cause, right? Maybe it was nothing to do with the builder, right? Maybe a car ran into the shed and it fell down. Now, the fact that it's an external cause doesn't mean that it can't be dealt with in the contract. Oh, okay, great. But one of the things, I mean, this is by no means a full list of all the things you might want to consider. And I think someone came up with building codes, which would also be relevant. But some of the other things I thought of was, well, maybe there was an unrealistic time frame.
So really quickly, unrealistic time frame, would that be, like anything legal as a reasonable person would determine that to be a time, or how would that be?
Well, let's say the circumstance might be the customer says, look, I need you to build this shed, and I need it done by tomorrow. And the builder said, look, there's just no way I can do it. And then the customer says, well, just do it anyway. Right? And then the builder says, well, I'll do it, but I am liable if it falls down. Right? That sort of and compliance with directions from the customer. So that's the same sort of thing is the customer says, look, I want you to use this material even though the material is rubbish. It's not going to work properly. And the builder says, no. And this comes in, this will become relevant, for example, where you're developing software and the software is complying with the specifications of the customer. And the customer then says, oh, by the way, I want you to make sure that you don't infringe any patents. Right? And then you say, well, but I'm doing this the way you told me to do it. Why do you think I can then, exclude patents from, or give you some sort of comfort in relation to patents? And so the issue with all of that is that it all comes down to what you've agreed. And the shared example that I've given you is basically every other contract that you'll ever come across it's encapsulated in that shared example. And the reality is that there is no one size fits all to these things. And it depends on a lot of things, including price. And I said earlier that price was that pivot around which other things happen. Now, the fact that there might be all of these things which might affect the shed falling down doesn't change the fact that you can apportion risk in relation to each of them in your contract. Right? To the extent that you can anticipate them, and even to some extent, to the extent you can't anticipate them, you can stick it in the contract and pin it on one or other of the parties. There is one aspect of it though is that if you agree to do X, and doing X, in order to do X you have to do Y, then ordinarily you'll be taken to have also agreed to have done Y. Right? And you need to be aware of things like that when you're talking to the other side about what it is that you're doing. Because if, for example, what you're agreeing to do is put in a system which has an open source component, then they might think, well, you actually, you're being a vendor for that open source component. I'm going to treat you like any other vendor of any other component, even though this open source component is actually a third-party product that you don't have necessarily any control over. The best way of dealing with issues, and I'm going to repeat this later on, is to make sure you've been clear relatively early as to what it is that you're doing. Because if you put in a proposal, look, I'm doing X, but I'm not doing Y, you have to work out Y for yourself, then the issue never comes up, or ought never come up, that you are liable for doing Y. But if you're doing a contract with them and you're going through it and then they say, oh, well, in order to do X, we have to do Y, then the question is, well, then they look at you and say, well, you didn't say you were going to do Y. You have to do Y in order to do X. Therefore, we're expecting you to do Y. Right? And then you've got this issue about, do you just cop it sweet, as they say, or do you make an issue of it and say, look, I'm not doing Y? And the thing is, you don't even have that conversation if your proposal is sufficiently clear to start with. So, what's involved in a negotiation? A negotiation sort of tracks down a certain sort of pathway, which usually goes along the lines of you talk to the business, the customer within the business that you're selling to, or you talk to their business owner, and you say, look, I'm going to do X for you, and they say, great, get onto it. And then somehow it goes off to the lawyers, and it just seems to get stuck there for a long time. And then after a while you come out with a contract. And it's in that lawyer cycle that I've said that you can come up against some difficult issues, because you, depending on who you are and what you're dealing with, it can be more easy or less easy. And you have to deal with the level, lots of things which are not necessarily related to what it is you've just agreed with the business owner in order to get through this lawyer cycle. And so, you might be getting stuff from the legal team on the other side, those awful people, based on ignorance, right? They just might have no idea what open source is. And because they have no idea what open source is, they take their existing experience in relation to closed source, they pick it up and they dump it into the contract. And it's like, this just, there's no mesh. It doesn't fit properly. Past experience, so they might have had a nasty experience in relation to open source, and that would usually be something like, I've had a compliance letter sent to me by the Free Software Foundation, and we were actually not compliant, and now we're sort of hyper-vigilant about open source compliance, and therefore I want you to do all of these extra things. Impatience or lack of time, so they just want to get it done and they actually don't want to negotiate with you. Or internal policies, and that's where the lawyer pulls out all this stuff and says, look, in order to sign this agreement, we've got to have all these clauses in it, and don't ask me why, it's just what they tell me. And all of those issues are, not, then any one of them, there's not necessarily any relationship between what it is that you're actually doing, what your actual circumstances are. The only saving feature, I guess, of all of this is that it is not usually within the remit of the lawyers to recast the deal. Right? So if you've agreed with the business person to do X, it's usually not going to be the case that the lawyer is going to say, well, shouldn't you be doing Y? Shouldn't we be agreeing to do Y? It's usually the case that you're stuck within what's agreed. Now, there's usually a lot of play in relation to what's been agreed, but things which are clearly inconsistent with what's agreed, the lawyer shouldn't be getting into, and the lawyer will usually not even attempt to get into. And that, again, is why your proposal is important. So if your proposal maps out what it is that you're going to do and what you're not going to do, then that's sort of like staking out the grounds where the lawyers shouldn't be going. So you've gone through the negotiation process and the lawyer cycle. What sort of things are you likely to be coming up against when you are talking to the lawyers? And the key things tend to be liability and ownership. And there you see them encapsulated, you break it, you fix it, and I pay for it, I own it. And they're usually fairly standard guiding principles that you'll run up against. And now, again, it comes to what it is that you're doing. And so, if you are, each of these can be varied from this default position by what you've agreed with the business person. So if you've said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this open source library, I'm going to be extending it, I want you to pay me to do it, I'm going to contribute it back to the library when I'm finished, but I'll give it to you first, or I might do something else with it. Then those things can override these ownership, these things, this requirement for ownership. But it might be something that you need to, and so what will happen is that the lawyer will say to you, well, we're paying for it, we own it. And then you say, well, I've actually agreed this, this, and this. And then they go, oh, well, and they get a little bit upset with you. The way these issues express themselves in relation to open source typically are liability for third-party components, so FLOSS components. And the conversation is sort of the customer says, well, you're providing to me a solution, And I don't really care what parts make up that solution. You're liable for the solution. From your point of view, you're saying, well, these FLOSS components, these open source components, I don't have any control over. I get them as they are. I don't particularly want to be liable for those things. What I'm really doing is providing an integration layer between this library and the rest of your system. And IP ownership. And usually what you find with customers is, or customer contracts, is that they'll have some line in there saying that you're licensing them all of this stuff that you're providing to them. And that's not right. So the things that I'm going to talk about, those two issues, IP ownership and liability, as expressed through a number of scenarios. And the first scenario is the licensing of FLOSS components. And this is an extract from GPL version 3, clause 10. And what it says is, each time you convey a covered work, and convey has a specific meaning, but basically means that you give someone a copy of the covered work, the recipient automatically receives a license from the original licensor to run, modify, and propagate that work subject to this license. And the key thing that I'm pointing out here, I'm not sure whether you've noticed it, but it's sort of in bold type, it says from the original licensor. Right? So other licenses might go into more or less detail on the point, but they're all more or less consistent. To the extent that they talk about that, they'll say something along these lines, and others won't. Others might be silent completely. So diagrammatically, what's happening is, you as the user, you're getting a copy of the software, and that software, with that copy, you get a license, and that license allows you to make other copies of it and to give them to other people. But when you give them another copy, while they get a license, they do not get it from you. Right? So the copyright holder in the open source project, you get a copy from them. You get a license when you get that copy. You give a copy to the third party. That third party gets the license directly from the copyright holder. And so that's where this wording from the original licensors, why that's relevant. And that's actually not all that mysterious, because the only people who can grant licenses over a piece of software or other copyright material are the people who hold copyright in that material. Right? If you don't hold copyright, you cannot grant a license. In all of these cases, I'm talking about third-party free software that, not yours. If it's yours, none of this applies. It's all relevant. None of this applies if it's yours. You can do what you like. But if it's a third-party product, you can't agree to grant a license to a customer. You can't agree to grant a license to anybody. And I'm not saying you can't agree. I'm not just saying you can't agree to grant them a closed source license. I'm saying you can't agree to grant them any sort of license at all, right? Because you just do not have the rights to grant a license. And so this comes up in things like warranties in relation to ownership. So there'll be some line item on a warranty which says you warrant that you own all of the software, or you warrant that you own or have the right to license all of the software you provide under this agreement. And clauses like that you basically can't agree to. The other way that the clause can be pulled in is the warranty itself says you warrant that you can license all of the supplier software. And then you go back to the supplier software, and the supplier software has this really broad definition which catches all of the open source and third-party components that you're providing under the agreement. And so you just have to be alive to the issue that the license doesn't come from you, it comes from the original licensor. So, while you can't grant a license, you're not capable of granting a license, what you can do is provide copies. And so you can agree, for example, to provide a copy of some open source software. The difficulty arises though when there's some confusion about what it is you're doing. Right? Whether all you are doing is giving them a copy, or whether you're actually, what you're doing is sort of making some sort of recommendation when you give them a copy. I think you should use this because it'll solve all of the problems. If that's being brought along when you're giving them a copy, then you've got some sort of a problem which you ought to be addressing in your proposal or in your statement to them about what it is that you're actually doing. Any issues on, is licensing clear enough? Good. All right, so next one is where you're using an open source product as an input into what it is that you're doing. So, for example, you might be engaged to extend an existing project. Maybe you're, and the question is, well, what happens to the code that you're producing as a result of that work that you're doing? And there's some possibilities. Maybe you're going to give the code back, you'll extend the library. Maybe the code will be lost forever in the customer's embrace, or maybe something else might happen. And the thing that I wanted to point out to you is that it's actually relatively difficult to map all of the possible ways that things might flow through. So I've got up here on just a couple of possibilities. You've got some open source code up the top. You've got some pre-existing code, by which I mean it's your code, right? It's stuff that you've been working on yourself. And you've got the client code and client confidential information. And all of these things can end up possibly in any of the, anything from the left-hand side can possibly end up in anything from the right-hand side. And it can also go by different pathways. So the client might want you to take some open source code and produce some specific code specifically for them, subject to the license on the open source code allowing you to do this. And after you've delivered it to them, they might then decide, well, and then we're going to do a compliance check that it's okay to release it, and then it'll go back into the open source library, or maybe it might go some other way. But what the client is particularly not interested in doing is having the code that it provides to you or confidential information that it provides to you winding up in the open source code, because that's sort of like, that's the disaster scenario that they're all taught about when they go to their internal training to do with open source. What you need to do when you're faced with this scenario is think about where you're going to get to, because you need to think about where you're going to get to before you start. So if your intention is that the code that you produce will end up going back into the open source library, then when you start, you have to put a process in place to make sure that what you're doing doesn't use any of the customer's confidential information, or doesn't use any of their internal closed source code. Or to the extent it does, you go through a process of approving that code to get out, or that confidential information to get out. It's no good doing the work and then discovering that you've used some of their confidential information, and now you've got this code that you want to release back out to open source, and you just can't do it because you've already done the work and you've done it in such a way that you're going to be releasing the client's confidential information, and they're not happy about doing that. The other thing is it's probably, it sort of depends on the scenario. I mean, I should have renamed this talk, It All Depends. It all depends on the scenario. There will be some cases where the customer requirements fit well within what the open source product does. And there'll be other cases where there's a very poor fit between the two of them, which you're probably not going to do because that would be too much trouble for you to implement. But what might occur is where there's a partial coverage between what the open source component can do and what the customer's requirements are. And in those scenarios, you have to think about, well, how am I going to deal with that gap? How am I going to deal with that gap? And am I going to deal with it by writing my own code to cover it? Or another way to deal with it is to tell the client, well, this is what it does, and you just got to be happy with it, and maybe you should be scaling back your own requirements. And it becomes, and so this slide is sort of mildly interesting, but the more interesting slide is what happens tomorrow. Right? So you've all sorted it out with the client today, and then things change. Right? So the way that they're developing as a client, what their requirements are going in one direction, but the requirements of the open source code are going in another direction. If they're developing in the same direction, woohoo, you don't have to worry, right? You're all covered. But if they're developing in different directions, you've got a problem because the gap is going to keep increasing, or it's going to keep changing. And so you need to, if you were in this scenario on the right-hand side, you have to think about how it is you're going to deal with this possible divergence. And the divergence might also be stagnation, right? So maybe the project, the open source project that you want to use, suddenly has an implosion of the developers and it stops going somewhere. What do you do in those circumstances? That's a difficult one. It's a difficult one. You might, my preference, if you can get it over the line with your customers, is to say that the open source components are just a dependency. What I'm doing is the extensions to it. And so, if it's a dependency that they have to organise, then so be it. Where it goes, it goes. If you're in the situation where you have to, if you're in the situation where that's not acceptable to the client, you've got to step up to the plate and cover some of it. You've got this issue of, well, if there's a problem, do I maintain a parallel? Do I maintain a parallel version of the software that I'm creating that might be, and then you have to maintain a couple of versions to keep in track with the main line, and do you put those things back into the main line, or do you try and keep them maintained separately? Whether you can or cannot might be dependent upon how you've priced it. So if you've priced it as time and materials, then maybe you're going, no problems, I'll just charge you extra time to keep you in sync with what's happening with the way that they're diverging. Although if you've quoted a fixed price and the fixed price has not anticipated the manner in which they're diverging, then you've got a bigger problem. What happens when something goes wrong, and this is sort of a continuation of what we've talked about in the last slide, is something's going wrong, so there's a bug. It just doesn't work. So it's not that the requirements, it doesn't fit the requirements, it's actually not working. So they turn it on, it stops working, maybe it's, the year 2000 and falls over or something, there's some reason. And then the question is, well, what's your responsibility in getting a fix done? And do you have any responsibility? And it'll depend a little bit upon the sort of scenarios. So here, where you've done some integration, you've got some sort of layer between between the open source code and the client's system. and the problem is in the integration layer, then you're probably going to have the ability to fix the problem, and the customer is probably going to expect you to fix the problem. The more difficult issue is where the problem is within the open source component itself, and then the issue is, well, are you responsible for fixing it? And if so, what happens? What's the process for fixing it? And do you do you simply wait until it gets the process for fixing it might just be I'll lodge a bug report and hope that it gets fixed sooner or later, and then when it gets fixed in the upstream product, pull it down. You might also have to be more active in fixing a bug. So maybe you will go in and actually do some coding to fix the problem. And then the question is, well, you've got this fixed. Do you just keep it to yourself, or do you contribute it back to the main to the main line? And ordinarily, you're probably going to want to try and push it back up to the main line, because then you don't have to worry so much about maintaining it going forward. And the last two, I guess the last 2 points are basically it depends. You know, what is it that you want? What is it that the client wants to do? And when you are negotiating your contract, if you've thought about these options and you've thought about how you're going to deal with those options, you can present a solution to the client, which you're going to be better able to argue than if you haven't thought about these problems. Next issue is liability. And the guiding principle relating to liability is that if you cannot control it, you should not accept liability for it. When you do accept liability for things you can't control, that's called gambling. And I'm not here to talk about gambling today. But you might choose to do so in appropriate circumstances. So, and that would be where the price is right, the risk is low, you've got some means of managing the risk that you think is going to be acceptable, so that you can control the consequences of a breach on your part. So, indemnities over free and open source software. My general answer to a request that you provide indemnity over an open source product, a third-party open source product, not your own, the general answer really is no. And the reason it's no is you've got no control. You know. There's other reasons, which are that policy over the last couple of years, over the last decade or so, the consequences of a breach of an IP right have become disproportionate, and so not only do you have no control, but the consequences of a breach don't reflect the damage that might be suffered as a result of the breach. So you can't control it. The exposure is going to be disproportionately high, and even understanding what it is that you have to do is often a complex issue. And so these things, so an IP indemnity, the reason, basically, the position or the function that an IP indemnity plays in a contract is a warranty as to title. That's basically what an IP indemnity is. And they were very, very prevalent, you know, in the 90s, and even recently they've been quite prevalent. But more often nowadays, the answer is just no, even not in the open source context. And it's for those reasons that I've covered. So I thought I'd give you an example of what sort of liability you might be looking at if you were paying for a license, and if you're paying for quite a, you might be paying quite a substantial amount of money for a license. And this is an extract from an end-user license agreement which says basically you've got no recourse against the licensor of the software. And this is a clause taken from a person who is granting a license over their own software. Right? So this is not, we're not talking about a third-party product that they're supplying. It's their own software. And they're saying you can get a refund from your manufacturer or installer, but that's it. And moreover, I think I find these sort of funny, but it's the sort of way they do things in the software industry. You've got a warranty for 90 days. And it's like, well, you know, if there's a problem with the software, it was there. You know, if it happens on day 91, it was sort of there on day 90, don't you think? But anyway, that's the way they do things. And the thing to take from this wording is that there is no warranty of ownership, right? And there is no indemnity being provided in relation to this software. Now, I haven't done a comprehensive review of all of the agreements which are up on that website, but I'm pretty confident that they will have similar wording or a similar liability regime embedded in them. And so, if you're dealing with an open source product, my approach would be that you ought not be providing an indemnity in relation to that open source product, mainly because it's outside of your control to do anything about it. But that said, you know, there are other options, and the one that I think you probably should be thinking about is describing the open source components as a dependency. So just as the operating system is a dependency and you're saying, well, this won't work unless you've got such and such operating system installed, equally you can say these open source components are a dependency, and when I'm doing this work, it presupposes that these open source components are already installed. And in that case, what you're doing is you're effectively shifting the risk over to the customer, because then they have to go and get the open source component. The thing that you might do is provide a separate service, which is acquisition, get a copy of open source software service, and that service can be very clear about what it is you're doing, which is providing a copy of the dependency that they need. But if you're separating them out conceptually, then you've got an easier argument, because you say, look, for the open source components, it's a dependency. You can get it yourself, or you can use my get your dependencies for you service. But these are the terms for that special get your dependency service. And those terms say, all I'm doing is getting a copy. I'm not actually making any warranties in relation to the copy that I'm providing you. And that allows you to then be more robust with your own, when you're talking about your own product, because you can say, look, I warrant this, this and this about the stuff that I'm producing for you. And there's no chance, because they're in separate documents, there's no chance of the warranties you're giving in relation to your own work being interpreted as being in relation to these dependencies. You could price the risk and buy insurance, and so that option is to actually give an indemnity, but you buy insurance to cover the possible risk. And there are other things which are provided by third parties like OpenLogic, which are sort of acquisition management services, where they'll certify that the open source components that you're getting and providing meet certain criteria, and that can help in giving your customer comfort as to what it is that they're acquiring, and making them feel more comfortable about going forward. The final thing you can do is to give a quote indemnity, which had been floating around in the industry for many years now, but those indemnities are often a different clause with the word indemnity written on the top of them, rather than an indemnity in the traditional sense. And what they often do is they say, if there is an IP infringement, then what we will do is we will repair it, or we will replace it, or we will give you a refund. Right? And the issue about repair, replace, or refund is none of those things cover the possible damage that the customer might suffer as a result of an IP infringement which might arise. And even they don't even cover the extra cost that a customer might incur in implementing your new solution or implementing the replacement that you're providing. So, we're at the end of the talk. It's all dependent upon the circumstances. It's guided, or it's what your proposal sets the scene for the whole of the negotiations which follow. When you are in negotiations, the issues or the things which are driving the negotiations may be completely irrelevant. Right? They might be just determined by a policy, and you've just got to argue against them. But if you are in the position where your proposal has been appropriate, you're in a much better position to argue about the policies which they're providing. And that, I think, will bring me to the end. Are there any questions? The lady in the front.
I was just wondering, maybe it's slightly on this topic, maybe I should do this later. But how do you go in the area of just something that I'm seeing more recently is companies not paying?
Not really open source related here.
No, I mean but yeah, so maybe it's something I guess.
Maybe later. But just for all of you, the thing about companies not paying is get your payment terms correct, and stop providing the service if they've stopped paying. Right? Short payment terms means you can manage your risk a little bit better. Get payment up front, maybe for a discount, those sorts of things.
And in regards to contracts as well, so I've had experiences in both, doing the full paper contract again, and then also on the verbal contract side of it. And as far as my experience has been in my legal information, has been both pretty much the same. And also when it comes to a contract, a lot of times you might get a contract that just has crap in it that's really unsustainable, and I've had kind of lawyers say, you will actually pay this X to, that really wouldn't stand up in the court of law anyway.
Well, I mean, if it's in the contract, you should expect that you need to comply with it. That would be my first point. That would be the first. Maybe it's not enforceable, but it's going to cost you a lot of money to prove it's not enforceable. So it's better for it not to be there. Any other? Yeah? What in particular? I mean, in a sense, this discussion about policies and approach is,
What sort of penalties, what is the government asking for on top of if using open source licensing?
I'd need to go and have a look at the GITC. I mean, they've got these Procure IT. They've got standard contracts that they apply. And from memory, they're being more, what's the word, accommodating in relation to open source recently. So 5 years ago, I think they were sort of learning, and nowadays I think they're probably more accommodating in relation to open source. But I'd need to. So it varies. It varies depending upon the level of government you're talking to and whether you're talking to, which state you're talking to, and whether it's a Commonwealth. So, other than saying I think that they're more accommodating now than they were before.
So is that in the field of liability?
Yeah, well, what I'm specifically thinking about is requirements for the grant of license. I think that that those sorts of contracts are generally better structured. They don't ask for a license, which is impossible to grant, and I think that they are more more accommodating on the liability issues as well, I'd need to go and look at them. But I think that the harder issue for government contracts is that they're just so large that it's very difficult, it's very expensive to even respond to them. I think that's probably the more the issue. And they're often tethered to a request for proposals, which is inconsistent with an open source solution. That's often the other issue.
So we're going to have time for a couple more questions.
This is your last chance, guys. Come on. It was such a complete talk that I've answered all your questions. Oh, fantastic.
Okay, in that case, that sounds great. So please thank Brendan Scott.
Thanks, guys.